Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Tasktop. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting panel ahead, but first I have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First, today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live webinar today. If you have any questions for Naomi or Carmen, we want you to submit those using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of the screen. That's also where you're going to find the chat tab. This is where we want you to engage with our discussion today. Let us know your thoughts and chime in. We may include it in the dialogue. We also have a couple of polls that will be scattered throughout today's webinar. And there are some handouts available under the Handouts tab to help aid in today's discussion. Feel free to download those at your own leisure. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around. So on to the topic today. May the 4th be with you. Your speakers for the webinar today are Carmen DeArdo and Naomi Lurie. And this is as close as they got to a Star Wars effect. So Carmen DeArdo is Senior Director of Value Stream Management and R&D at Tasktop. Carmen consults with organizations on project-to-product transformations to accelerate and improve their time to market and predictability. He's the co-author of Standing on Shoulders, A Leader's Guide to Digital Transformation, which was awarded the Best 2020 DevOps Book of the Year. Congratulations. Naomi Lurie is VP of Product Marketing at Tasktop. She has over 20 years of experience helping organizations accelerate their digital transformations, from embracing customer engagement analytics to deploying mobile payment technology. At Tasktop, she's been helping spread the word and supporting the adoption of value stream management as a fundamental discipline in the shift from project to product. And our topic today is the 7 dimensions of a project to product transformation. Naomi and Carmen, may the 4th be with you. You can have the floor from here.
Thank you, Cody. May the 4th be with you too, and to all our listeners. We're really happy to be here today. So let's dive in. According to Gartner, in a 2018 survey, 85% of participating respondents said they had already adopted or had plans to adopt a product-centric model. That means that the majority of enterprises were beginning this transition back in 2018, motivated by a desire for faster delivery and a need to support the transformation to digital business. So here we are 4 years later, and like everyone else, we were very curious to examine how organizations are traversing this complex multi-year process. Because this shift is literally our business at Tasktop, we've been lucky enough to have front row seats to the transition at many of the world's largest enterprises. And in addition, we've recently launched an assessment that can complement what we were seeing boots on the ground with the industry's experience at large, basically the voice of everyone else, right? And that's what we're going to be looking at today with you. So in today's talk, we are going to talk about the 5 stages or steps of the shift. Like, what does that journey look like at a macro level? How do companies advance step by step? We'll also discuss the 7 dimensions of change that must be completed to reach maturity and how they're woven into those 5 stages. We'll share early findings from our research into the state of the industry, how advanced organizations are in the operationalizing of this new model and reaping its benefits. And based on those findings, we'll share some practical advice for getting through the hardest parts. So throughout the presentation, we'll also be sharing how you can self-assess where your organization is in the shift and how you can recenter your efforts to be able to advance to the next stage in case you've kind of lost your way. So back in 2018, the industry didn't have tools that were designed to support the shift from project to product. So everything we knew about it, kind of in discussions about organizations' efforts to move to a product-based operating model, were mostly based on collective knowledge, experiences, observation, research. But here at Tasktop, since around the middle of 2019, we've been supporting organizations with this journey with a turnkey value stream management platform that's called Tasktopviz, which you can just see a little bit of it here. And that's where we explicitly measure and help the shift, for the entire product portfolio. So, like I mentioned, we have this kind of firsthand evidence from the world's largest organizations that are shifting their model, and we can see what's happening in their current state and also the steps that they're taking to navigate the transition. And that intimate view of those transformations, including the flow metrics and the insights that we have from their value streams, have allowed us to be able to describe the journey from project to product as 5 major stages. So, turning to you, Carmen, how about you start us off by walking us through those stages at a high level?
Sure, Naomi. So the stages are starting out, experimentation, expansion, operationalizing, and then approaching maturity. So let's talk about these a little bit. In a traditional IT organization, your starting point is typically a situation where you're operating fully in a project model. So that means all work, except perhaps run work, is done in projects, and you have an annual funding model. So what does that mean? That means we're constantly bringing people to the work, right? So teams are constantly being formed, stormed, and then disbanded. And they spend a lot of time in project-related meetings. Another characteristic that we see is application integrity is hard to manage. So the dependencies aren't really visible, and they're also hard to manage. And this can lead to large batch-sized projects and long, highly coordinated release cycles. So, your ticket out of stage 1 is really being able to articulate and measure the negative business consequences of the current state, and then creating a hypothesis on the positive outcomes, the positive business outcomes you could achieve through a shift to a product-oriented, product operating model. And that leads you into step 2, experimentation. And that typically is done on a well-contained, highly visible, external-facing product because it naturally lends itself more to rapid innovation, and there's a strong business incentive to speed up delivery. This is where you're learning, through trial and error, experimentation, where the shift actually entails an individual product or product line level and proving out its value. As you start experimenting and you achieve some results from that, some patterns that we'll talk about later, then you want to start expanding, which is giving more and more portfolios the same treatment. But we often see at this stage is that the principles are not necessarily even applied to all IT assets, especially your internal products and your platforms, which means there are still plenty of process and product dependencies that prevent faster lead times. Operationalizing is where you work these things out based on the understanding that every product needs an independent and rapid path to production and customer feedback within a quarter. That's where metrics and OKRs emphasize achieving business outcomes and faster flow. And finally, when you're approaching maturity, the last pieces start to fall into place. You have more responsive and flexible funding models. You're on shorter planning intervals. You have really well-defined interfaces between systems, patterns of self-service, the capability for independent releases with dark launching options, and a strong product management discipline. Now, even at Tasktop, where we've always been in a product model, we're still working at getting better at doing it. The maturity and understanding all the different types of products, not just customer facing, is really key as you go through this journey.
Great. Well, thank you, Carmen. That was a great introduction and kind of overview. So everybody look at the screen for a second. And what we want to do next is we're going to launch our first poll. So Cody, if you could do that. What we're asking here is what's your gut feel thinking about your organization at large? What stage do you think you're in? Are you just starting out? Have you begun experimenting? Are you already past experimenting and now expanding into more and more products and portfolios? Have you operationalized this across the company? And are you really, delivering kind of independently and getting feedback within a quarter, as Carmen said? Or are you way beyond? Have you approached maturity and really are fully operating in that product model? So let's hear your thoughts. And then we're going to go a little deeper and kind of color this in. Okay, so let's see what we're seeing here. Maybe people are still voting, and it's cool to see it kind of happening live, but a lot of you are experimenting, and then some have moved into expansion, a few into operationalizing, and just a few in approaching maturity. And many still starting out, and that's not rare, actually. And that's actually good that you're here, because you're going to kind of understand what that journey looks like. Yeah, this is really great. Great to see. So soon we're going to show you some things that are coming out, like the state of the industry as it's emerging, and you'll be able to kind of compare yourself to those findings. But yeah, majority starting out, a lot of experimentation, and then we're gradually moving into expansion and operationalizing. And only a few would say that they are actually approaching maturity. So that's really interesting. Thank you, Cody. I think we are ready to go back to our slide. So bearing that in mind, let's talk a little bit about the dimensions of change. So, in the book Project to Product, which was published in 2018 by Mick Kirsten, who is Tasktop CEO and co-founder, Mick laid out the 7 differences between project and product operating models in terms of budgeting, timeframes, the definition of success, how risk is handled, how teams are organized, how work is prioritized, and how visibility is achieved. Because this is a multi-year process, it can be quite easy to lose one's way or become disoriented, when you're trying to make the changes, right, and address those differences. So we found a way to kind of reframe those differences as 7 dimensions of change that must occur gradually as an organization progresses through the 5 stages. And the reason why we did this reframing is that now we can pose these kind of as questions, and these dimensions create a model for self-assessment so you can figure out where you are in the shift. And that's necessary because it's complicated, and occasionally you need to kind of collect yourself and understand where you are in order to take the next step. So by understanding the dimensions of change, you can keep your focus and muster the strength it takes to persevere and keep the momentum going. So here are the dimensions. They're similar to the differences, but stated slightly differently. We have team organization and resourcing, customer centricity, the definition of value, backlog management and prioritization, dependency management, feedback speed, and delivery team metrics. So let's look at that. In each of these dimensions, we've observed 4 progressions. Okay, for example, let's just take number 3 over here. How clear is the definition of value? So in a project model, the emphasis, of course, is on being on time and on budget. So most individuals would be hard pressed to explain how they contribute to tangible business outcomes beyond that, right? When you begin the shift, gradually, some leaders will be able to articulate the business drivers for the product. And as you get closer to a product model, most product managers can articulate the value they provide to their customers and the business. But at maturity, At maturity, value is so well defined that it serves as a focal point for every single team member. So even if they are in a platform team or working on an internal product, which most are, product teams are focused on the incremental delivery of value in order to achieve well understood business outcomes. Okay, so there are these 4 steps for each of these dimensions. Now, what we've observed is that organizations do not necessarily move from stage to stage evenly across all dimensions, right? So for example, I'll give you some real life examples. A large financial institution is really improving on backlog management and prioritization, right? They have a product manager, drives the product vision and roadmap, cares about the long-term viability of the product, has a roadmap, knows how to do trade-offs, prioritization, and all that. But they still they can't revise their plans rapidly based on customer feedback because they have only a few highly governed release windows a year. So there's a bit of a dissonance there, right? So they've advanced well on one dimension, but not so well on the other. I'll give you another example. Let's take an insurance company, right? Which we know they have their entire portfolio organized in continuously funded cross-functional build and run teams, right? The dream. but still only a few leaders can define the value. So it's not even, and because of that, it can be confusing. You can be under the impression that you're, quite advanced in your product operating model when really you have like kind of these lagging behaviors, right? So the goal is to bring those all into line and be able to progress evenly through the dimensions as much as possible. So, you yourself can take this 5-minute assessment that has these multiple choice questions, right? The 4 for each stage, and it kind of takes the pulse of your organization's progress and slots you into a stage. And then you get a read on where you are and then some pragmatic recommendations of what to do to be poised to take the next step. So this assessment is still open at tasktop.com/assessment. So we encourage you to take it, not at this very moment, but shortly after this webinar, and help yourself kind of understand where you are and also help us define the state of the industry. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But I bet you're really curious to hear some early findings from the assessment that we've done already, right? Where are most organizations at? So before we answer that question, I want to pull you just once more, and I want to ask you, where do you think that most of the organizations of the world are at, right? Are most of them starting out, experimenting, expanding, operationalizing, approaching maturity, right? You saw your own answers, right? Of this audience, this is clearly an audience that is interested in progressing in that journey. So you're here. What do you think about other people? So make your guesses, and then we'll compare it with the data. So Cody, do we have some early answers yet? They're rolling in. There you go. Okay, let's see.
And this is with about 50% of respondents.
Okay, thank you, Cody. Yeah, so people keep voting, because it's very interesting to see where you would say the industry is at as a whole. Yeah, a lot of experimentation, concentrated in experimentation. Yeah, and not a lot of people approaching maturity is what you're saying. Okay, let's give it like 10 more seconds, have these answers kind of land, and then we'll look at what we're really seeing. But here we're basically seeing like 75% are still starting out and experimenting, and then we have the rest of the 25% kind of in expansion and operationalizing. Okay, guys, cool. I mean, more or less, right? That's what we see. Okay, great. Thank you, Cody. I think we can close that now. And now I will share some early findings. So this is how it's going, right? Early findings actually show that the majority of organizations, 78%, have not yet fully operationalized the shift. Okay, that means that they're in stages 1, 2, and 3, starting out, experimenting, and expanding, right? They haven't gone into the operationalizing stage. And of course, the approaching maturity stage, we have just a little fraction. And that's really where the true ROI is captured. So you folks kind of in your guess was that more people were still in the experimentation and starting out phase. And that's really interesting. And, we encourage you to also take the assessment to help, kind of correct these early findings if the reality is really different. So we have two hypotheses, right? Why is everybody kind of concentrated in experimenting and expansion? So either it's hard to expand, right? Maybe experimentation is taking longer, or we haven't established those patterns that are kind of required to move to the next stage, or that expansion itself simply takes a long time. Going from experimenting with a little bit of your portfolio to really expanding broadly into the organization, that takes a long time. And actually, that makes a lot of sense to me. So, what we've done is, given this data and that so many organizations are, starting out, experimenting, and trying to expand, we're going to share some tips for each of those stages, okay? So if you're in starting out, listen about the guidelines for experimenting, and then if you're in experimenting, kind of pay close attention to the guidelines and the tips for moving into expansion. So Carmen, take it away. Give us some tips for experimentation.
Thanks, Naomi. So I think like any experiment, the first thing is you need to define your success criteria in advance. So it's very important to establish that clarity up front. So for example, it could be something like focused on speed, and delivery and accelerating your capability to deliver business value. A second point is, you want to start with a product or an experiment that goes all the way through ideate, through deploy and support. And you want to set up a team with an empowered product owner and give them some funding that can manage themselves for the duration of the experiment. And then you want to map and measure the time from the customer's perspective. So when you're talking about lead time, it's important that you're thinking about it from the customer's viewpoint and any other metrics like throughput, quality, and efficiency. Mick in his book talks a lot about the disconnect between language of IT and business. IT talks about things like story points and other things that don't resonate from a business perspective, or they have metrics that don't really resonate. Like, well, we can get stories done in 2 weeks. Well, if you're getting your stories done in 2 weeks, but your features are taking 2 months, and that's what your customer's seeing, they don't really care the fact that you can do these 2-week sprints and get stories done. As you're doing the work, you want to understand all the dependencies, and that includes your shared internal and platform teams, which many times get lost behind. That way you can potentially tackle the issues of mitigating delays the product is experiencing and start experimenting about them. This is where you start developing the patterns that can be later expanded on. And finally, any improvement work that you're doing needs to be visible itself. Don't hide it. Your leaders and peers need to understand the capacity and effort that has to go into this. And so all work has to be visible, which is something our peer, Dominica Grandis, talks about in her book. Making work visible, that includes all this work that you're doing to improve and learn as you go through this process.
Yeah, great tips, Carmen. Okay, so I am going to add on to that it is quite possible that organizations rush to expansion before they've really maximized the learnings from their experiments. Pardon me. So here are some tips that we want to give you to make sure that the experimentation is solid enough to see you through a successful expansion. So first, don't rush until you've developed those good, solid patterns for operating in a product model. So what do we mean by patterns? Patterns, include turning SLAs into self-service for things like creating test environments, testing, including routine performance and security testing, releasing on demand, monitoring. Another pattern can be like having a dedicated consulting team for certain capabilities that require a deeper level of expertise. Codify these learnings in sustainable and repeatable patterns. You're basically writing the playbook of patterns that can be expanded on in the future and used during that expansion phase. So the other thing that we see is expansions fail when they don't know how to apply a product treatment to internal and platform products. So even though we said, start with like a highly visible, external facing product, we also are saying include the products that are supporting them, right? The internal products, the platform products that are basically process and product dependencies for that product. So kind of work through a deep slice of your portfolio during an experimentation phase. Then you'll really know what to do during the expansion, right? And you won't be limited to treating only those external facing products, but none of their dependencies. The other thing is to make sure you take the time to tell the stories of your experiment to the organization, to drive that cultural change, which we'll talk about quite a bit towards the end, and make sure that you're also getting the attention of leaders by tying your success stories to tangible business benefits related to really to top line growth or bottom line savings, talent retention metrics. These things really matter. And lastly, understand that additional learnings are going to come from when you scale, and that's okay. So you kind of have to have an open mind that this is going to be a continuous improvement process. You have to leave some time during expansion for refactoring the patterns and, based on the future learnings that you get. So now I'm going to hand it back over to you, Carmen. Given the fact that we know that funding is the last thing to change in many large organizations, as you expand and operationalize, what can you do to kind of empower the product manager, the product owner, the product teams, give them some flexibility until there's actually, an official process that naturally does this, like a continuous funding process?
Sure, Naomi. It's interesting because I spent a lot of my career at Bell Labs in telecommunications, and so we were in a product model, even though we didn't really talk about being in a product model. And back then we had a strategy of every quarter revisiting our priorities and determining which products investments need to shift in. So I had an interesting experience when I joined after I left Bell Labs, when I started to be really immersed in this project-centric model and this annual funding cycle. And so, the first step here is you have to be able to allow that strategy of funding to be revisited regularly. I mean, I just said something about quarterly, monthly, whatever makes sense to adjust funding levels. And your investments should be made, again, by that product rather than initiative. Initiatives come and go. They're temporal. Products are what's going to sustain your business. They're the engine. And the internal products and the platform products, I really believe, are your innovative engine, because everything else rides on top of those. So you need to look at the priorities of those and adjust them. And then they determine the product team size. Then throughout the year, again, perhaps quarterly begin with, determine if those needs, require some priorities to change and adjust those product funding levels. So in this model, you're establishing the teams, you're bringing work to the teams, rather than in the project model where you're taking people from the teams to the work, and they're then charging to all various number of projects where they spent a little bit of time. Now they're fully focused, they're fully funded by this product model. Your product owner, is now empowered to fund and prioritize the work. So that reduces the time from the idea to work starting. So you're getting away from a lot of the protracted discussions you had. I used to talk about the fact that sometimes there were arguments between the 50th and the 51st thing that we wanted to start. Really, the product manager should know these are the next few things we want to get going and kick them off as part of, flowing them through, ideate into your value stream. And so you want to extend your visual management board to the left to visualize the work that occurs prior to work entering the agile development backlog. In a project model, this is where hundreds of days can be lost, and you're trying to prevent that. In one of my previous places where I worked, we estimated we spent half our time and money before work ever got into the backlog of an agile team. And it wasn't visible and it wasn't being tracked. So even if we were perfect from code to cloud, we were leaving all that time and money on the table that we weren't really focused on improving. You want to embed those business roles as part of your team and co-locate them with the team if possible. And then staff the team itself with full stack abilities. You can do work across technical domains and assets using techniques such as inner sourcing, which eliminate the need for complicated resource planning and demand processes. You'll find that you can replace 8-week cycles of meetings and documentation with a few focused 2 to 4 hour meetings.
Yeah, that's great. I also want to say that we see the great questions coming in, and we will definitely be answering those, just in just a few minutes when we get through our core set of slides here. So Carmen, what are some of the anti-patterns that you've seen and you would recommend people avoid in the shift?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting subject, Naomi. So the first anti-pattern is people want to start with the reorg. And so they want to start with a paper reorg without doing any experimenting or understanding what's really going to work for their organization. So it's very important to start small, experiment, learn what's going to work in your organization with your culture. I saw some questions about culture, and culture is key as with any change. And so you really need to understand what patterns are going to work for you before you start to roll these out and start to make organizational change. Another anti-pattern is not having clear metrics or a compass to measure success on the journey. A lot of times when we'll talk to companies, they'll say, well, we're not mature enough to start measuring, how things are going. Well, when you're on a trip, you want a compass. And the less certain you are about the trip, the more you want a compass to make sure you're going in the right direction. So having clear metrics to measure success is important, and know what's working, what isn't, test your hypothesis at part in looking at the metrics that you're seeing. Another anti-pattern is basing the journey strictly on time rather than progress. You really can't force this, especially at the start. It's very tempting sometimes to say, we're going to do this in 4 waves over 3 quarters and just stick to that plan. Well, you need to be open at the beginning, understand what you're going to learn. It's not a one and done. It's a continuous improvement journey. And you're going to learn things along the way that are going to cause you to refactor your plans. You can't assume that whatever you learn to start with is going to be the end of your learning. You will continue to learn. You want to continue to learn. And so you need to plan that into the way you're progressing this and expanding. One thing that catches a lot of organizations is local OKRs and local optimizations. I mean, we have bad habits. We've been in silos. We can't assume that we can just snap our fingers and those bad habits are going to go away. So we have to be on the watch for things and ask ourselves, is this OKR really going to improve something for our customers? And again, if you're a platform team or an internal shared team, your customers are other people in your organization. So it's not always about the external customers. For the internal teams, it's about your direct customers. And are the things we're doing going to help them? Do we know what provides value to them? Avoid the local optimizations that sometimes are very tempting, but actually work against improving the system. It's kind of an anti-pattern to Gene Kim's first wave of improving the system as a whole. And then we've already touched on that, ignoring the internal platform products, which are really the innovation engine, and not treating them as first-class products. And then again, the human element. We know how important culture is, and that has to be addressed. And I know, Naomi, you're going to talk more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is near and dear to our heart because we know that you can technically do all the right things and still lose the people, right? And the paradox is that although people desire change, they resist change. And the shift from project to product is a huge change, right? And that introduces risk and uncertainty and forces people to get out of their comfort zones. And, to be honest, there's also this unspoken accusation that what you've done until now might not be good enough. And maybe there's some loss of face associated with that. So if you don't approach the shift with the necessary sensitivity to the human and cultural aspects, it's not going to succeed. So we have 6 tips to manage the culture change. These are our last tips for today before we move on to your questions. So Carmen, why don't you kick us off with the first 3?
Thanks, Naomi. So, this isn't just for the cool kids. This can't be set up to be something that is only for a selected part of your organization. This is for everybody. So even though your experiment may typically begin with a business digital product, it has to be inclusive if it's going to be successful. You have to be able to reach into the deeper layers of your internal products, which really what Mick calls the value stream network, and those supporting platforms, and include some of them in your initial experiment. You also have to be aware around the different types of mindsets. There's a question around this, and especially fixed mindsets. It's fair to assume many people in your organization will be of a fixed mindset for whom change will be very threatening. And so you have to try to make the journey as non-threatening as possible. Don't be overly critical of the current state. It got you where you were. It made you a Fortune 500, 100, whatever company. But so you have to emphasize their experience is important and valuable to the new initiative. Now, having said that, you also can't be defensive in terms of change. You have to be open to improvement. And then you have to empower teams. John Smart talks a lot about this if you ever watched him speak, and it's a true empowerment of the teams. And too often we forget the people doing the work are in the best position to determine what changes and what improvements to make. Sometimes we hire external consultants to tell us all the things we're doing wrong, when really the teams themselves should charter their own transformation journey. This goes back into the Deming concept of quality circles. The people closest to the work are the ones that know the most about how to improve. Leaders don't need to have the ideas to improve. Leaders need to set their teams free so that they can experiment and improve. So as a start, provide the team with metrics that reflect their current performance. These aren't used to judge the team. These aren't used as some kind of grade report. They're used not to compare with others, but to make them available for consumption so they can be used as a compass on this journey. And then give them that license to be creative and experiment. And you'll be amazed by what they'll come up with. Celebrate those improvements. Celebrate the participation. Celebrate the fact that you have people engaged on this journey to get better, and they will.
Yeah, that's so great. And also, if you can map out those stages for them and kind of the change that should happen in different dimensions as they progress, they pretty much could work with that, I think, in kind of charting out the path. So I'm going to add 3 more. There's nothing worse than getting people all excited about an experiment or a change and then putting up barriers to their progress and then doing it again and again. If you do it 3 or 4 times, you've just killed their motivation, right? Nobody wants to feel like a Ferrari that's surrounded by a herd of sheep. So make sure that your experiments are not blocked by red tape and slow approval cycles. That's just a recipe for cultural disaster. Instead, you have to make sure that leaders can keep up with the energy that the people have. Number 5, don't throw out ideas just because they aren't right? You're not going to be able to implement every good idea today, but that doesn't mean it's not a good idea. So be careful not to dismiss people's good ideas just because, the organization or the environment is not quite ready for them today. Instead, experiment where you can and create a backlog of good ideas to return to when the environment is right. And lastly, don't let perfect be the enemy of good or better, because we know that software development in the modern, large organization is vastly complex and the progress can be slow and that could lead to frustration. So you have to make sure your teams can appreciate just how far they've come by reminding them how it used to be even, 6, 12, 18 months ago. Granted, there's always going to be more to do, but there's still value in all that's been achieved. And at large, complex organizations, progress will come from a continuous series of baby steps and not from a big bang. Okay, so just to summarize, and I'll answer some of the questions that you folks were asking about the assessment itself. I think what we learn is that this is a long process, right? With a lot of change that needs to be driven and sustained across multiple dimensions. If people have started this journey back in 2018, and here we are 4 years later, and still clustered, I would say, in the early stages of getting started, experimenting, trying to expand, that means that we need to be able to persevere for many more years on this journey. And because of that, you really have to stay focused. You have to know what are the things that you still haven't touched on and addressed. So I think that having a map and a visual aid and a step-by-step guidance for each stage is very helpful, right? And all the while, you're trying to make sure not to fall into those pitfalls and anti-patterns. And for those of you who've asked if you can get the slides, of course, you'll be able to get the slides, but also just when you take the assessment, you get an ebook that just details all those things. You'll have all the questions and all the stages and all the dimensions and what to do to get from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, and God willing to 5, right? So some of you were asking, oh, do you have this data by industry? The more people who answer the assessment, take the assessment, the more we'll be able to slice and dice it by all these different dimensions. Federal, someone asked about federal government, stuff like that. So the more people who lend their voice, it will help us as an industry understand where people are getting stuck and what solutions could we provide, as vendors, as thought leaders, to help get through those difficult, sticky parts, right? So we really recommend taking the assessment, and not only to fit, you as an individual. I'm sure you work in a big company. Have many people from your company take it. See if you all got the same results. Are you all seeing the picture in the same way? And I think what's going to come out of this is going to be extremely interesting. So now I think we are ready to move into the Q&A portion of this talk.
Sure. And let's start from the beginning. So during the early stages of the shift, what are some of the most common bottlenecks and constraints that you find?
Yeah.
So I think what we see initially is that even though, and I'm going to tie this into some of the other questions since you give me more room to talk, because I saw some questions about Agile. I even saw some questions about DevOps.
Yeah.
When you think about a value stream and you think about wanting to go start, really improve flow across the entire value stream, it gives you a different perspective on how to view the work and then how to organize around the work. Because what you're trying to do is not just be agile in one place, right, which is typically in create or development, but be agile across the entire value stream. And it also means that you have something that's sustainable. The problem with project models are they're not sustainable. Products are sustainable, projects are not. So I think when you look at approaches, for example, a pull model, if you don't really understand and treat your internal products and platforms as products and implement them in this model, what happens is work is still being committed for other people and is being pushed upon them and is creating too much work for them. So what we see is a lot of areas with too much work in progress, even though, they would say they have an agile model, they're only pulling in work within an iteration or a program increment or whatever. They actually don't, because of the way work is being committed and pushed onto them. So we see a lot of work in progress, too much work in progress, drowning some of these internal teams. We also see a lot of bottlenecks outside of, again, the dev and test parts of the process, which have been, in some cases, already optimized to some degree. So we will see work pile up. I was working customer yesterday, and based on their capacity, they had over 24 months of work sitting on the left-hand side of their value stream. That means this is work that had been invested in, spent some amount of time to get to a point where it was going to be prioritized. And you have to ask yourself, you really want 24 months of work sitting, waiting to descend on your teams? Does that make sense? That's overproduction. That's a form of waste. At the same time, there was a bottleneck on the right-hand side of the value stream in testing. And some of the folks who have the experience in writing the requirements could have helped out with the UAT. So if you took a step back, you would say, we're overproducing on the left-hand side, we're under capacity or under resourced on the right-hand side, we should do a shift. But because of silos and local optimizations and OKRs, that just doesn't happen. And no one really has that overall view that you would if you were looking at this from a product perspective. So, those are some of the experiences that we've been seeing over the last, I don't know, 3 years of working with customers along this journey.
Yeah. And if I could just pile on over there, and also kind of continue what Carmen was doing, which was connecting to a few of the other questions about the relationship between the shift and agile transformations and DevOps transformations. I think, what we see is that agile and DevOps are terrific, but they're not enough. Because until you really develop a product-centric view, you can't tell when you're not doing DevOps well enough or not doing Agile good enough because of that kind of still siloed view of the world, right? Everybody measuring how they're doing in their little, portion of the value stream from customer request to customer delivery. They don't care how long the feedback loops are, how long things age to the point of diminishing return when it's outside of their little world. And what we see is that while I think the industry at large treats DevOps capabilities as, table stakes at this point, oh, everybody's doing it. Everybody can release on demand. Everybody's deploying thousands of times a day. Simply not the case. Not the case. And, time and time again, what we discover, especially for organizations that are starting out on the journey, like many of you are, that there are serious bottlenecks where the DevOps pipeline begins because there are still highly coordinated releases, difficulty to automate testing on these very complex legacy platforms, lots of layers of dependencies and stuff like that. So the knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, we should just hire more developers, but you don't necessarily need more developers. You might need more, people who are capable of doing automated testing or DevOps engineers or people working on your pipelines, right? So that everybody can benefit from them. So it's just like that assumption that things are just hunky-dory when it comes to DevOps is not the case. So at least in a product model, you can make that quite evident. This is where we need the money. This is where we slow down. This is where, it takes us 9 months instead of 3. So I think that that's very important. And I would say, when it comes to Agile, we see people doing Agile without being Agile. Yeah, we're doing the ceremonies and so on, but we're not really living the principles of pulling in the work based on actual capacity and incrementally delivering value and getting fast feedback. Like that part is missing. So business agility is not what you think it is. Many teams are overloaded. Work is planned 2 years in advance for them. Where's the agility in that? And I'm telling you, this is common. So we have issues of both efficiency and effectiveness. And the beauty of a product model, even if you're starting out, you can create visibility by product and start to see these things very clearly. And it's really about getting the results from Agile and DevOps by creating the right level of visibility that's tied to business outcomes so that you can get the investments you need where you need them. If you need them in DevOps, you need them in developers, you need more product owners, right? UX designers, how do you know? Only a product view is going to give you that information.
Exactly. I think a lot of times, especially when we talk to the internal or platform teams, when we ask, well, what value are you providing? They have a hard time answering that question. And it's not a criticism of them. It's just the fact that because they haven't been treated as true products and their customers identified as, the internal people of the organization who are benefiting from their services, they haven't really been thinking that way. So when you think about business results, you think about value, cost, quality, we talk a lot about cost and we have a lot of quality metrics, but we don't really talk enough about value and what that really means, again, for some of these other products that aren't external facing. And then another key metric is happiness of the team, because happy teams are productive and productive teams are happy. So keeping your pulse on the team, and this isn't one of those surveys around your organization because that just measures silos again. This is your teams themselves. If we know that if we start to see the results for a team go south, there's probably something going on. They have too much whip. They're not getting enough time to invest in debt and improving. So that causes us to look deeper into what's happening here, because eventually that will impact productivity, flow, and what the results, that the outcomes that the customers will experience. So it's important to keep a pulse on those teams, and understand how they're doing, because that's a good leading indicator of the outcomes that you're going to get from those teams.
So Carmen, you did mention key metrics. So what would you say are other key metrics that most organizations would benefit from to realize their business value?
So in the flow framework, Mick Kirsten developed some flow metrics that we utilize and we measure and share with our customers, and those are things like flow velocity, flow time, flow efficiency. A lot of times when we measure how things are going, we look at the people, and we have this goal to keep people busy. Well, first of all, you don't want people to be 100% utilized, because that doesn't give you any time to adapt for unplanned events or innovation. But secondly, it's really the work that's weights. It's the work that builds up. That's what's invisible when you look at a product value stream. So we want to shine the light on where is your work weighting, so that you can then say, okay, why is this happening? And have the team come up with some hypothesis to experiment on. And so the work in progress is really important to understand. Is it aging? Are things getting old? Is work getting neglected, abandoned even? Understanding the characteristics of your work in progress, again, is a leading indicator of how work will eventually be delivered. And so those are the kind of metrics I think that teams need to keep their eye on, and then run experiments on to see, can you change the characteristics of flow where you want flow to improve, which means you have to understand where flow is not happening. Where's work getting hung up? Why is it getting hung up there? And then that brings into some of the questions I think that came up about DevOps practices. That's where you would apply a DevOps practice. Because, okay, a lot of things are stuck in ready to test. That means the active state, the test state, maybe it's taking too long. That's where maybe you want to do more automated testing. Maybe you have SLAs, right, for things like performance testing, security testing, infrastructure. You want to turn those SLAs into self-service. So by keeping your eye on the metrics and understanding where that work is getting hung up, you can then develop your hypothesis to run your experiments, see what worked, create that pattern, and then that pattern is something that can be shared across the organization.
Yeah, and I would add to all those things is that then you have to tie that to the business, right? So what does the business care about? We're all trying to get new capabilities into market faster, right? Or into the hands of our internal customers faster, so we can excel as a business. We need to grow revenue, right? We need to capture market share, all those things. We need to be more efficient, more cost effective. So there are all these things that translate the benefits of getting things done fast and efficiently are being faster than your competitors. I mean, when it's external products, and being able to be more operationally excellent when it comes to how you run your business. So we're talking about improving time to market, improving predictability. You made a commitment that something's going to be ready by May 1st. You want to be able to make those commitments. There's a whole go-to-market engine that relies on you, and any delay that you create, wreaks havoc elsewhere, requires expensive replanning and resetting of stuff. So time to market, predictability, efficiency. So we all have, a fixed set of capacity. Like we have 10 developers, like we want to be maximizing the ROI. So if they're worked on something and that code is done, we want that code out the door as fast as possible, so we don't incur the cost of delay, right? And open the door to somebody to get that code, that capability done before us. So the impact of being able to get things done faster, bringing forward the revenue or the gains that we are expecting, even if they're cost savings or compliance, all those things, making them happen faster is surely a benefit for the organization. You're trying to get that down from 250 days, 350 days, and we've seen these numbers. Get those things down to within a quarter so you can be competitive.
And I think along with that, we talk a little bit about, well, how do you really do this and start if you don't have complete buy-in from the organization? I mean, there's a question around that.
Yeah.
And I remember I was in a situation once where I was in an organization, we had 20 different business areas, over 20, and someone said to me, well, you couldn't get the leaders of those business areas to agree on what color the sky was, Carmen. I was like, well, I don't need to get all 20 to agree right now. I just need one to go on this journey with us. And then once we talk about culture, the most powerful thing to change culture is stories. If you can get teams telling their stories, not consultant stories, not a story from another company that they saw at a conference, their own stories from their own organization, those resonate. Those resonate not only with the people who get excited and would like to work on those teams, but the leaders, all of a sudden, their business leaders are saying, hey, how come I'm seeing this other area they can release more frequently? Their productivity is improving, their flow time's going down. How come I can't get any of that? So those stories create a cultural change. Now, yes, there's clearly a role for leaders. There's systemic problems that leaders need to own, right? WIP can be a systemic issue of how you're addressing that. So eventually, yes, there is a key component here for leaders to do the systems thinking, but I wouldn't use the fact that you don't have an entire bought-in strategy around this to start and carve out a place where you can start experimenting, creating those stories, and then allowing those stories to help drive the culture to start to move you on your way.
Well, it seems we are approaching the top of the hour, and wow, those 57 minutes flew by. Do you guys have anything that you would like to leave our audience with before we do wrap things up and give away some gift cards?
Well, I mean, I guess we'd like to say thank you. This was a great conversation, and you guys asked wonderful questions, and we're sorry that we didn't get through all of them, but they were all terrific. Yeah, what can we say? We want you to take the assessment. We think it's so valuable to understand where you are and get that help in figuring out what you should be doing next or what you should be completing in order to be able to take your next step going forward, and allow that to orient you on this journey and maybe help people around you see the work to be done. So we encourage you to take the assessment and, reach out to Tasktop also if you have any questions about project to product or value stream management in a product-centric model.
Yeah, thanks again, and great questions, and we'd love to continue the conversation, so reach out. Thank you.
Well, Carmen and Naomi, thank you both so much for being with us today. I'd like to remind our audience that this session was recorded, so following the panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand. You'll also find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars, and just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So like I said at the beginning of the hour, we do have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Mike D. Our second winner is Yannick A. Our third winner is Luis F. And our fourth and final winner is Gonzalo P. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't find an email, check your spam folder. I would like to thank Tasktop for sponsoring today's webinar. And my final thanks, as always, goes to you, our audience. Thank you so much for joining us today and for participating in our polls. We ask for just one extra moment of your time to fill out a quick post-webinar survey that should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. But otherwise, we do hope to see you at a future upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar. Everyone have a great rest of your day. And again, Naomi, Carmen, thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you all, and thank you, Cody.
Thank you.